It's happening. We're going to war with Britain. No, not now. I'm a historian. My mind's already back in 1775. Full disclosure, I don't really get military history. Like, I get it, but I don't really see the point in every high school student learning about every battle in American history, so we're not going to do that. You might want to go to a different YouTube channel for that. But we do need to talk about some of the key events of the war, which will include some battles. Basically, what I'm saying is that if you're listening and you're a military history buff, it's going to be really frustrating for you. Sorry. So the first shots of the American Revolution were fired a full year before the US declared its independence. British troops, or redcoats, were already stationed in the colonies, and when they realized that many of the colonies were preparing to fight, they tried to seize military supplies before too many fell into the hands of the local militias. From Boston, around 700 redcoats marched to military stores at Concord. While on their way, they met with 77 local Minutemen, so called because they were private citizens who could be ready to fight in a minute, who had scrambled to intercept the British troops, thanks in part to a heads up from Paul Revere, the guy who makes all these engravings on his Etsy store. Now, we don't know who fired the first shot, which is later nicknamed the shot heard round the world. But the British quickly moved forward. When they got to Lexington, most of the military supplies had been hidden or destroyed, and a few hundred American patriots were waiting for them. They decided to withdraw, but the entire march back to Boston was grueling as the colonists took up guerrilla warfare tactics, hiding in trees or barns, shooting British soldiers in the back, etc. By the end of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the British lost 273 soldiers to the Americans' 95. Quickly, 16,000 New Englanders joined forces and began laying siege to Boston to try to kick out the British forces stationed there. Remember those intolerable acts. The revolution had basically begun. Now, why was this called the shot heard round the world? I mean, think about it. Throughout all of world history, civilizations have been dominated by empires. And there had been rebellions before, but very few that were actually successful. And this was the height of the British Empire. They were the indisputable global military power, and we were a bunch of pesky Minutemen with guns. It would be as if Puerto Rico took up arms against the US government. Everyone in the world would be paying attention to see what happened next. Also, let's talk about Paul Revere. First, he was the son of a Frenchman whose original name was Apollo Revere, Dib's baby name, but his dad changed it to the more English-sounding Paul Revere. Revere had been one of the revolutionaries who participated in the Boston Tea Party, but it was his ride on April 18th, 1775 that made him immortal. And yes, he did ride to warn the colonists that the British were coming toward Lexington, but two other guys did that too, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott. And honestly, Paul Revere wasn't really a household name, at least for this reason, until almost 100 years later. You see, in the 1850s, spoiler alert, with America on the eve of a civil war, there was a wave of super nationalistic patriotic art. Painters, writers, poets all became very nostalgic for the time of the Revolution, when most Americans were united in a common cause, because they were experiencing such a terrible divided time in American history in their own life. So pro tip, when you're going through a museum and you see some old piece of art that's really patriotic, you can just kind of bet that it was made in the 1850s. For example, Washington crossing the Delaware was painted in 1851, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote his poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, in 1861, published 1 month after South Carolina seceded from the Union. Okay, really quickly, here are a few things that happened in the American Revolution before we declared our independence. George Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Oh, hey, George. We lost to the British at Bunker Hill, but we defended the area outside Boston so effectively that it kind of surprised the British. This was the battle you might have heard of where the commander told his men to not shoot until you see the whites of their eyes, to conserve bullets and kind of hold the hill as long as possible. Eventually, the Americans will kick the British out of Boston entirely, woohoo! And the British Navy will be forced to move up to Canada. So, also before we declare independence, we invaded Canada. American troops occupied Montreal, and Benedict Arnold tried to take Quebec, but he failed. I don't feel that bad for him. We also fought loyalists in the colonies, especially in the South. About 1/5 of the colonists stayed loyal to Britain, and so they became the Patriots' first focus. How could we beat the British if 20% of our own population was working with them? This meant subduing other colonists, throwing some in jail, and even in one case, burning the city of Norfolk, Virginia. Often in the South, we were fighting a mixture of British troops, Native Americans, and loyalist colonists. Also, before we officially declared independence, we formed a small navy, the Continental Fleet, to disrupt British ships and trading. We even captured an island in the Bahamas. We keep trying to take Quebec. No luck. Spoiler, we're never going to take Quebec. Again, all of this happened before the colonists had agreed that they actually wanted to be independent. There were those who still wanted some sort of resolution or representation in the British government, but not to be separate from it completely. And if you think about it, it's really kind of a crazy idea to break away from the British Empire. I mean, it's a scary world in the late 18th century, dominated by European superpowers who are all desperate for as much land and money as possible. Sure, you're pissed at Britain, but they're also protecting you from everyone else in the world. What would happen if you were all of a sudden alone in the wilderness, an ocean away from civilization, without any sort of unified organization? I mean, when I say it that way, were we dumb? Was this a terrible idea? Anyway, there was still a lot of debate as to what to do, but there were a few prominent speakers and writers who did a lot to convince everyone that independence was really necessary. The most influential of these thinkers was Thomas Paine, or T-Pain, as I'm going to call him just to anger any younger viewers out there who hate it when adults make references that were cool like more than a decade ago. So T-Pain wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. It was written very simply in plain, direct language to convince all Americans of his argument. It very clearly argued that independence was not just necessary, but it was inevitable. It was common sense. Here's a quote. "Even the distance at which the Almighty hath placed England and America is a strong and natural proof that the authority of the one over the other was never the design of heaven." Notice the language he's using, natural proof, the design of heaven. He's arguing that it's God's will that the Americas be independent. A lot of his language is intentionally connected to Protestant beliefs about individual rights, again, this unifying impact of the Great Awakening. He goes on, "But where, says some, is the King of America? I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above, and doth not make havoc of mankind like the royal brute of Britain." Okay, so first of all, those are like fighting words. I can't say this enough. All of these men would have been hanged for treason if we had lost. But again, he's responding to a common question in the colonies. Like, okay, fine. Who will be our new king? Seriously, the idea of just straight up not having a king was somewhat unimaginable for at least a lot of people. Common Sense was printed and distributed all across the colonies, and many would read it aloud at taverns and other meeting places. In proportion to the population at the time, it had the largest sale and circulation of any book published in American history. That's still true today. It's the best-selling American title ever and is still in print today. John Adams later said, "Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain." Quick side note, Thomas Paine then later moved to Europe and became influential in the French Revolution too, until he got caught up in the Reign of Terror and was imprisoned by Robespierre himself. While in prison, he wrote a book called The Age of Reason and a few other works that called for, among other things, freedom of thought, the end of institutionalized religion, and a guaranteed minimum wage. He also never made any money off of the publication and success of Common Sense, partly because as he maintained his anonymity for the first few months, he kind of got screwed out of payments by his publisher. He also refused to get a copyright, so he never profited off of the most influential work in American literary history. When he died in 1809, only 6 people attended his funeral because his ideas, especially his criticism of Christianity, had made him so unpopular. But arguably, without his writings, many would not have been convinced that a complete separation from Britain was necessary. Thanks, T-Pain. Okay, so by July, the Congress decided it was time to make things official. In 1776, the Congress passed the Lee Resolution. What? I bet you thought I was going to say the Declaration of Independence. Nope. The Lee Resolution was the actual legal document that asserted our independence. The Declaration was basically the announcement of that resolution being passed. So Thomas Jefferson was kind of like the ultimate hype man for the Continental Congress. And interestingly, the Lee Resolution was named for its author, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. Yeah, that Lee family from Virginia. Just a few generations later, the same family tree would produce Robert E. Lee, but more on him in a few episodes. So we declared independence on July 4th, 1776. Actually, we declared it on July 2nd, but it got formally approved on July 4th. And it wasn't actually signed until August 2nd. Oh, Congress, slow to get things done from the start. I could go into a whole thing about the Declaration of Independence, but I kind of feel pretty confident that y'all already know that one, right? Like, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all white property-owning men are created equal. Yeah, okay, let's move on. So the war is on, and it's not looking so great for the Americans. We were up against the freaking British Empire with the best military in the world and a ton of money to spend. Thanks, colonies, for all those cash crops and a totally free labor source, but the US had some advantages too. For one, the Americans were fighting on our home turf. We knew the land better and we were close to our homes, supplies, and other necessities, whereas the British were an ocean away from any backup or additional resources. And also, as the war drags on, there are going to be those at home in England who kind of wonder if it's all worth the trouble. But in America, we were fighting for our freedom, so it was worth it, finally. And this is the most important reason why we won the war. Listen up. We didn't have to win the war. Let me explain. Head to head, the British would destroy the Americans easily. I'm sorry, Patriots. Inspirational speeches can only get you so far, but the only objective that the Americans had was to get the British to leave them alone. So we didn't have to win anything. We just had to not lose. We needed to drag the war out as long as possible until the British decided to just take their ball and go home. And that's what happened. Now, it's not the sexiest way to win a war, but it works. The other reason we defeated the British was because we got critical help from the French. You should check out my entire podcast episode on Lafayette, but basically the French stepped in to support our cause midway through the revolution. Why? Well, for one, there were many in France, like my boyfriend Lafayette, who believed in the ideals of the revolution. And we know that's true because they would go on to implement them in their own country's revolution just a few years later. The French didn't fully commit, though, until our victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. Side note, Saratoga was renamed Schuylerville later after the famous Schuyler family that those of you who've seen Hamilton know all about. But the French government was also willing to help the Americans because they saw it as kind of a neat opportunity to take down their enemy, the British. And it should be noted that a lot of the world powers felt the same way. Founded by Catherine the Great of Russia, a collection of other powers like Prussia, it's a real place, Austria, Portugal, and the Ottoman Empire joined together to protect against the British boarding and searching ships for contraband going to support the colonies. So thanks, Catherine, Europeans, and Muslims for helping us win our revolution. Cool. Yada, yada, yada. 4 more years of fighting go by. I told you that my military history buffs were going to be really annoyed at this one. The decisive battle occurs in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia. In the end, British General Cornwallis surrenders to George Washington, and the revolution is effectively over. It's not actually over. There were still British forces spread throughout the colonies, especially in the South. It took another year for the two sides to agree to just stop fighting, and then another year after that to sign the Treaty of Paris. So the American Revolution ended in 1783, with the British formally recognizing the 13 colonies to be free and independent states over which they had no claim on the land or the government. Woohoo! USA! USA! Negotiated by John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and Henry Lawrence, John Lawrence's dad, for my Hamilton fans, the treaty also granted the new United States land all the way to the Mississippi River. This was great news for the settlers who had been wanting to expand westward for years, right? That proclamation of 1763. But it was really bad news for the indigenous tribes who had been hoping the British would win because the British had promised them more formal recognition of sovereign Indian land. Basically, to most Native Americans at this point, the British were like the lesser of two white evils. Fun fact, Benjamin West, a famous American painter, started a portrait of the treaty negotiations. He got through the left side with the Americans, but then he could never finish the right side because the British refused to pose. Come on, don't be sore losers. You're still going to go on and control the rest of the globe. You'll be fine. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocial studies to show even extra support.